You probably know how to use the functions sum, count, and average in Excel. In this video, we're going to go over how to use a set of formulas for summarizing with criteria. This set of formulas is very useful when creating tables or reports in Excel. And the functions we're going to cover are SUMIF, SUMIFS, COUNTIF, COUNTIFS, AVERAGEIF, and AVERAGEIFS. The functions that end with if are able to sum, count, or average with one criterion. The ones that end with ifs are able to sum, count, or average with multiple criteria. So let's start with SUMIF and SUMIFS. Here we have data on salespeople. So for each salesperson, we have listed their gender, the region they worked in, and their total sales for 2017. Let's see if we can create a table that sums the total sales for each region. So here the criterion is region. So we'll use the SUMIF function equals SUMIF, and then within the parentheses you want a range and a criteria. And then if the range that the criteria applies to is different from the range of the numbers you're summing, you put the range of the numbers you're summing after the criterion. Okay, so the first range is the range to which the criterion applies. Our criterion is region, so we'll select the column with the regions, make that an absolute reference with F4, comma. Our criterion is the region. So I'm going to use a relative reference by just clicking on the region to the left here. And then another comma. Now we need the range that has the numbers we're summing. So I select the numbers in the total sales column. Again, we want to make that an absolute reference with F4. Type the closing parentheses and hit enter. Now I have a sum of all the sales in the North region. Before I copy that down, I want to format it as currency. So I go to the Home tab, currency. Okay, that's good. And now let's copy it down by double clicking on the bottom right. And now we have our total sales for each region. Let's practice that again by doing total sales by gender. So again, it's equals SUMIF. The first range is the range to which the criterion applies. Our criterion here is gender, so let's select all the genders, make an absolute reference, comma, add the criterion. Here I'm just going to click on it to get a relative reference, and then another comma. Now the range of numbers that are going to be summed. Make that an absolute reference. And we want to change that to a nice number format. And copy it down. Now we have total sales by gender. So that's the SUMIF function. If we have multiple criteria, for example here we want to make a list of total sales by region and gender. Now we have two criteria. For this we have to use the SUMIFS function. And filling out this table will also give us a good review of mixed cell references. Because if we use absolute and mixed cell references, we can put one function here, one formula here, and just copy it to the right and copy it down to fill in all of our total sales by region and gender. So we're going to use the SUMIFS function, equals SUMIFS, and then let's take a second to look at the tooltip. The way SUMIFS work is first you put the range of the numbers that are going to be summed. And then after that you put as many criteria as you need. With the criteria range, then the criteria. If there's another criterion, we go criteria range, criteria, criteria range, criteria. So first is the sum range. So let's get the numbers that are going to be summed. Make that an absolute reference. Type a comma. Now the first criteria range, let's do region. So we select the column with the region. Make that absolute with F4, comma. And what's our criteria for region? It's right here. So I'm going to click on north. Now, we're going to be copying this formula down and across. You can see when we copy it down, the region's going to change like we want it to. But when we copy it across, it's not going to work unless we change our cell reference. So we want to anchor the region in column I. So when we copy it down, it changes, but when we copy it to the right or left, it doesn't. So I'm going to put a $ before the I. Now let's go back to the end of the formula, type a comma. Next, we want to add the second criteria range, and that's the range that has gender. So let's select the gender column, use F4 to make it an absolute reference, type a comma. Now, where's the gender criteria? It's up here. So I'm just going to click on that, F for female, and then I can't see in here because of the tooltip, so I'm going to go up here to the formula bar. Now when we copy this formula to the right or to the left, we'll stay here in the same row. So what we need to do is when we copy it down, we don't want it to move down. So we're going to anchor it in row 4. So I put the $ before the 4, close the parentheses, and hit enter. So again, here's the formula we have. We have absolute references for all the ranges, and we have mixed references for the 2 criteria. Once we do that, we can copy this formula across and down. Now we have our total sales by region and gender. Okay, let's go to the next tab and do something similar, but now we're going to use COUNTIF and COUNTIFS. COUNTIF and COUNTIFS count things based on criteria. So now instead of doing the total sales, we're going to count how many salespeople do we have in each region, how many salespeople of each gender, and then count the number of salespeople by region and gender. So it's very similar, except for now the functions are COUNTIF and COUNTIFS. So let's count the salespeople by region. Equals COUNTIF. We want a range and a criteria. So the range is going to be just the region column, because we know that each row represents one salesperson. So if we count how many rows have the region north, that'll give us a count of how many salespeople in the north region. So again, since I'm going to be copying this formula down, I want to make it an absolute reference with F4, and type a comma, and then add the region by clicking on north. And since that's a relative reference, the region criteria will change as I copy this formula down. So I close the parentheses, hit enter. We have 3 salespeople in the north region. Double click on the corner to copy that down, and we see 4 salespeople in the south, 7 in the east, 4 in the west. Now let's do the same thing, but count salespeople by gender. So it's equals COUNTIF. Within the parentheses, first I need the range that has the genders, and I'm going to make that absolute with F4, type a comma, and click on the criterion. And we leave that as a relative reference so the criterion can change when we copy the formula down. Type the closing parentheses, hit enter. So we have 10 female salespeople and 8 male salespeople. Now, let's count the salespeople by region and gender. So now we have 2 criteria, so we're going to use the COUNTIFS function. Equals COUNTIFS. Now for this we just make a long set of range criteria. range, criteria, range, criteria. So let's do the region first. The range is this range that holds all the regions. Use F4 to make that an absolute reference, comma. The criterion for the region is this cell. Now again, we want this to adjust as we copy down, so we don't have to anchor the row, but we do want to anchor the column with a $sign so that when we copy this formula to the right, it stays on column I. So that's our first range and criteria, comma. The second range and criteria should be for the gender. So let's select the gender range, making an absolute reference with F4, comma. The gender criteria is going to be up here in these headings. So I'm going to click on F to get the first one. Now this criterion, when we copy down, we don't want it to go down. We want it to stay on row 4. So I'm going to anchor this one in row 4 by putting a $sign before the 4. Go to the end of the function and type the closing parentheses and hit enter. Now I have this formatted as a dollar amount. I don't like that, so I'm going to go over here and change that back to general. Now we should be able to copy across and copy down. And we have counts of salespeople in each region by gender. Okay, on the third tab, we're going to do something similar again, but now instead of summing or counting, we're going to average. So now we want the average sales by region, by gender, and then the average sales by region and gender. So first, we only have one criterion, so we can use the AVERAGEIF function. So it's equals AVERAGEIF. Now this is very similar to the SUMIF. First, we have a range to which the criteria applies. And then we have the criteria, and then we have the range with the numbers that we're averaging. So this is averaging by region. So the range to which the criterion applies is the region range. Make that an absolute reference by hitting F4, comma. The criterion is right to the left, and we'll use a relative reference so that can change when we copy the formula to new cells, comma. And the average range is the sales numbers. Make that an absolute reference. Type the closing parentheses, hit enter. Now we want to copy this down. Now we have average sales by region. Now let's review by doing average sales by gender. Equals AVERAGEIF. First range is the range to which the criterion applies. So we want the gender range. Make it an absolute reference, comma. Put a relative reference to the criterion, comma. And then an absolute reference to the range that has the numbers that we're averaging in it. Make that an absolute reference. Close the parentheses, enter. I want to make that into a currency format and then copy it down. So we have the average sales by gender. Now for the average sales by region and gender, we have multiple criteria. So we're going to use the AVERAGEIFS function. Equals AVERAGEIFS. The first thing is the average range. That's where the numbers are. And then we have sets of criteria, range, criteria. Criteria, range, criteria. So the numbers that we're averaging are in total sales. So let's make an absolute reference to that range, comma. The first criteria is region. So now we select the region range, make it absolute, type another comma, and now we add the criteria for the region. Click here on north. Again, as in the other examples, when we copy this formula down, we're fine because we want the row to change, to point to the subsequent criteria south, east, and west. But when we copy to the right, we do not want the column to change. So we have to anchor the column by putting a $ in front of it. Go back to the end, type a comma. Our second criteria range is the gender range. Make it absolute with F4, comma. Our criteria is up here, so click on female. And again, we're going to make that a mixed reference. So we want it to change when we copy to the right, but we don't want the row to change when we copy down. So we anchor the row by putting a $ in front of it and then close the parentheses. Hit enter. And now we can copy this across, copy down, and we have average sales by region and gender. Okay, a couple of comments to finish this video. One is we've been putting in the criterion by using references. You can always hard code criteria if you need to. So for example, if we wanted average sales in the north region, we did it by putting our cell reference, F5. Usually this is the best way to do it. But we don't have to do it that way. We could also type north for the criteria. Now, since it's a word, we have to put it in quotes. And we get the same number. The other comment is that actually SUMIFs, COUNTIFs, and AVERAGEIFS can do everything that SUMIF, COUNTIF, and AVERAGEIF can do. You just put one criterion. They have the capability of dealing with multiple criteria, but you don't have to use them that way. So if you wanted to learn as few functions as possible, you could just learn SUMIFs, COUNTIFs, and AVERAGEIFS, and you could do everything you could do with SUMIF, COUNTIF, and AVERAGEIF. So that's our tutorial on the summarizing functions.